Hello, I'm Norman Swan. Welcome to Tonic. In this week's edition, male depression, a hidden epidemic.
Men were being diagnosed with depression at half the rate of women, yet the suicide rate was 4 times that of women.
And if you're looking for a treat to make yourself feel better, have we got one for you.
If you've got someone lucky enough to lick the bowl, you'll be very popular. Doesn't that look beautiful?
I always thought depression was something that happened to other people. You know, especially being in a professional sporting environment, you know, any sort of excuse me, any sort of weakness gets covered up fairly quickly. So I think I had down moments, but just focused on the next training session or the next game, and you know, you're very much in this mindset that you're a winner, and you know, depression's for losers. That was how I used to think about it, and it's kind of funny how different I view it now, having experienced it.
We hear a lot about depression in the community. It's common, it's undertreated, and it's underdiagnosed. But there could well be a hidden epidemic of depression amongst men. And research from the University of British Columbia is explaining why and how the effects, if undiagnosed, could be far more drastic than expected.
We were fascinated with the younger fellows, how much pressure they were under in terms of having to achieve. So looking for really good grades, looking for a career perhaps before it was kind of emergent for them. In some ways, looking for a career before they finished their degree, looking to compete, looking to be as successful perhaps as their father. And I guess the economic, challenges perhaps, exacerbate some of that. But we were quite surprised at how young these men were and how they were really trying to make their way.
Caught up in the bubble of professional sport. It's a very fast-paced, exciting lifestyle. You're flying around the world, you're playing in packed stadiums, and then I think retiring, that transition from professional sport into the real world is kind of a high-risk period for athletes, and I think, for me, it just magnified all the other issues, and I had to deal with them. I didn't have a choice, I think, because there wasn't any other avenue to push into the background.
How does a depressed man present differently from a depressed woman?
So they've often presented as irritable, as having anger management issues, as maybe having substance overuse issues. So in those kind of ways, the traditional generic screening tools for depression won't necessarily capture those elements of a man's depression, and we know they're strongly linked to depression.
Does it give you any insight into why male depression is underdiagnosed?
The sense that we got was that these guys oftentimes would present with very typical male behaviours. So, for example...
Should be right.
Yeah, should be right. I'm okay, I'm a bit stressed. They might be self-medicating with alcohol, but it looks like a college guy who's enjoying a young man's life and having a bit of party time.
Oh, I never, it's funny, you wake up the morning after you've retired and there's no physios and doctors and strength and conditioning coaches and skills coaches and all the support staff that you have that all care when you're playing, what you're doing. And you wake up the morning after you retire and you realise that, no one really cares if you eat the right stuff or you train. And I really struggled. I put on a lot of weight, my sleep was affected, just all the sort of negative consequences of eating unhealthy food and not sleeping well and not exercising regularly. I had all of them.
So at one level, men were being diagnosed with depression at half the rate of women, yet the suicide rate was 4 times that of women.
Is it true in Canada, as it is in other countries, that the highest completed suicide rate in men is actually men over 75?
We do see the highest rate there, and we see it's 9 times that of women. That disparity between men and women is quite high in the older age groups.
And you have some fascinating findings in midlife.
We interviewed the female partners of men who were either diagnosed with depression or self-identified as depressed. So it was fascinating talking with them about how their relationships played out at home. The majority of these couples There was a bit of what we called trading places, where the men weren't necessarily the breadwinners. The women often moved into those roles, and the men often didn't have high libido. Lots of things kind of changed in what we'd say were normal, or not normal, but traditional gender roles.
So they were switching their roles?
They were switching.
It's interesting. I mean, it shows that despite the fact that we've got good drugs, there's good psychotherapies, the effect of depression on families is still profound.
Profound, absolutely. I mean, we know that if you have a spouse who's got a depression, you're more likely to develop one yourself. You know that if you've got children in the house, then they're more likely as well to develop depression if there's a depression in the house.
And elderly men?
Elderly men, fascinating. We spoke to these guys about depression, and many of these guys had what we called cumulative losses. So over a long period of time had developed kind of losses that they would catastrophise about and ruminate on. And when we
Such
spoke,
as?
Work. Work was the absolute catalyst for these guys. So it was often in regards to not having achieved as well as they might have liked in their career.
So regret kicks in.
Yeah, like looking back. And then even the guys who were still in work or part-time work and on the verge of retirement, there's limited opportunities for redemption, if you like, to sort of to get some of the things that they'd hoped for. So it was very, very interesting, because there's been all this literature around bereavement and older men as being a cause, and for sure, but there's some grief and loss goes on with work.
That suggests they viewed retirement negatively.
Yeah, a lot of the guys were really uncertain about retirement, and I guess when we collected the data in 2009-10, the economic hardship probably played into some of that, some of the uncertainty about can I live comfortably.
It can be difficult to tell the difference between normal emotions in response to a distressing situation and depression. In general, that divide is measured by how long the sadness lasts, whether it seriously impacts on your life, and how much it impairs your ability to function. So what sort of time frames for getting help are we talking about?
Most of the literature we have suggests that about 2 weeks is a good benchmark for something that's really persisting versus something that's a bit of a problem. So most of us have the experience of, for a few days, you feel like you're not coping so well, or you're really struggling with work or in relationship issues, but you sleep, you cope, you talk, you do things, and you start to see the world a bit differently again. So a few days of distress is quite normal. If it is really persisting, typically over 2 weeks, you start to see major impacts on people's function, they're not recovering, normal forms of support are not making a difference.
It definitely happened gradually. I think in hindsight I've realised I was depressed whilst I was playing, but never to the point where the depression took over my life and I was able to bounce back from it fairly quickly. It was only when I retired that I think I really started to struggle. I didn't have that crutch of sport to distract myself with. So that was when I think I really started to spiral into chronic depression. I experienced some child abuse when I was younger, and I think that was the underlying cause of my depression when I was playing and when I was growing up. But I'd never really dealt with it, and I'd probably not accepted how much it had affected me. And I think that was just one of the ways that I'd coped, was just the next training session, the next game.
It is actually the chronically stressful situations which are much more likely to result in depression or persisting psychological disturbance. So chronic financial difficulties, really bad relationship situations. One has got to do with change in the environment. The other's got to do with the change in the ways that we cope with that. Now, in a lot of situations, people go for partial coping, particularly through our favourite antidepressants, alcohol, pain relief, other strategies that we prescribe for ourselves to try and get us through the day, to try and get us to sleep that night, to try and function the next day. And many of those strategies that people choose become self-defeating and may actually exacerbate the problem.
So it started off with, I tell this story how my brother was selling chocolates for charity at school, and I used to wake up, so I had quite a bad facial injury when I retired, and had to have a titanium plate put in, and I was on a lot of painkillers and sleeping tablets. And I would wake up in the morning sort of stumble through in this fog of being half asleep and on medication, and go to my brother's room and throw some money on his desk and grab a box of Freddo Frog chocolates. Sort of walk back into my room and spend the day in bed just sort of on the net and eating chocolates, and that went on for a while. You know, it's just not very healthy. I was telling a friend that story, and there was this pause on the phone. He said, "That actually sounds like a pretty awesome day." It's probably not very sustainable.
What if the trigger is not a one-off event, if it's something long-term, like hating the job you're in?
If you're talking, for example, about teenage boys, you know, you're talking about boys who might be very sort of socially isolated, who get more withdrawn, who stop interacting with their friends, do poorly at school, and then are abusing alcohol or often more irritable or kind of aggressive when challenged about those sets of issues. Typically when you move a bit later, into 20s, you see people who are withdrawing from relationships, not making contact with people, struggling at work, you know, struggling to attend at work, and struggling to perform at work.